Sarah Mitchell's water broke at 4:47 in the afternoon while she was photographing a herd of elephants from the observation deck of Karibu Safari Lodge in Tanzania's Serengeti, and the timing was catastrophically wrong because she was only 37 weeks pregnant and had been explicitly advised by her obstetrician in Nairobi not to travel to remote locations during her third trimester. But Sarah had insisted on making this trip with her husband Marcus, because she believed that one final adventure before their daughter arrived would be the last opportunity they would have for years to experience the kind of freedom and spontaneity that parenthood would necessarily constrain. The contractions came fast and hard in the way that indicated labor was progressing too quickly for safe transport to the nearest medical facility, which was 3 hours away over roads that became impassable during the rainy season that had begun 2 weeks earlier than meteorologists had predicted. Within 20 minutes, Sarah was experiencing the kind of pain that suggested complications were developing beyond what could be managed with the basic first aid supplies available at the lodge, where the staff included a retired nurse named Patricia, who had delivered exactly 2 babies in her 40-year career. And neither of those deliveries had involved the kind of difficulties that were becoming apparent as Sarah's labor intensified with alarming speed. The baby was in distress based on Sarah's descriptions of reduced fetal movement over the previous hour, and Patricia made the decision to radio for emergency medical evacuation, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that delivery would occur before the helicopter could arrive from Arusha. The nearest equipped trauma center maintained its fleet of rescue aircraft that served a territory larger than some European countries, and response times to remote safari lodges averaged between 2 and 5 hours depending on weather conditions and aircraft availability. Sarah delivered her daughter at 6:23 p.m. in a small storage room that Patricia had converted into an improvised delivery space using clean sheets and bottled water, and the kind of desperate improvisation that characterized emergency childbirth in locations where modern medical infrastructure was absent and where outcomes depended entirely on the skill and luck of whoever happened to be present when crisis struck. The baby emerged crying with lungs that worked perfectly and limbs that moved with the uncoordinated vigor characteristic of healthy newborns, and for approximately 90 seconds everyone in that storage room believed that despite the premature timing and the absence of proper medical facilities, this birth was going to end well with mother and daughter both surviving what could have been a tragic outcome. Then Sarah started bleeding in amounts that Patricia recognized immediately as postpartum hemorrhage, which was the leading cause of maternal mortality worldwide and particularly dangerous in settings where blood transfusions and surgical intervention were unavailable. The hemorrhaging was severe and progressing rapidly in ways that indicated either uterine atony, where the organ failed to contract properly after delivery, or possibly a placental fragment retained inside that was preventing the uterus from closing the blood vessels that had supplied the pregnancy. Patricia applied every intervention she knew from her limited obstetric training, including uterine massage and medication from the lodge's emergency supply, but the bleeding continued with volume and speed that made it clear Sarah was going to die unless she received hospital-level care within minutes rather than the hours it would take for evacuation to arrive. Marcus held his wife's hand and whispered reassurances that both of them knew were lies, because Sarah was conscious enough to understand that she was dying and that her daughter, whom she had carried for 37 weeks and had just met 90 seconds ago, was going to grow up without a mother because of decisions Sarah had made about traveling to remote locations against medical advice. Sarah Mitchell died at 6:34 p.m., 11 minutes after giving birth to her daughter Emma, and her death was caused by massive postpartum hemorrhage that resulted in hypovolemic shock and cardiac arrest despite Patricia's desperate efforts to control the bleeding with resources that were catastrophically inadequate for the emergency they were facing. Marcus was asked to leave the room so that Patricia could perform the grim tasks associated with preparing a body for transport, while also caring for a newborn who was healthy but now motherless and whose immediate future was uncertain in terms of feeding and care until proper facilities could be reached. The storage room became a scene of overlapping tragedies, with Sarah's body covered by a sheet on one side and her crying daughter wrapped in blankets on the other. And Patricia was trying to manage both situations while also coordinating with the medical evacuation team that was still 90 minutes away, and with lodge management that was scrambling to figure out how to handle a maternal death and orphan newborn in a location designed for wildlife tourism rather than medical crises. What no one in that room knew during those immediate minutes after Sarah's death was that approximately 40 meters away from the storage room window, A 6-year-old lioness named Nola was resting beneath an acacia tree where she had retreated after an unsuccessful morning hunt that had left her hungry and alert to any opportunity for food that might present itself during the evening hours when prey animals became more active. Nola had given birth to her own cubs 4 months earlier, though only 2 of the 4 cubs had survived past their first month, and her body and brain was still flooded with the hormonal and neurological changes associated with motherhood that made her hyper-aware of infant distress signals regardless of species. When Emma's crying reached Nola's ears through the open window of the storage room, the lioness's auditory system processed those sounds and identified them as infant vocalizations indicating distress or hunger or discomfort, all of which were triggers that evolution had programmed into mammalian mothers as signals requiring immediate investigation and response. Before we continue this devastating story about how a newborn's cry reached across species boundaries to activate maternal instincts in a predator who should have viewed that infant as prey rather than as something to protect, if stories about the mysterious ways that motherhood transforms consciousness and creates bonds that transcend the normal patterns of nature touch something deep in your heart, we want to hear from you. Please tell us in the comments. How old are you, and where in the world are you watching this from? We love connecting with viewers across generations and continents, and knowing that these stories about the most profound aspects of mammalian emotion and instinct reach people everywhere regardless of culture or language reminds us that the bonds between mothers and infants represent something universal that operates at levels deeper than conscious thought or rational decision-making. Consider subscribing to Lion King Stories for more true tales that prove maternal love can override even the most fundamental predator-prey relationships, that the sound of a crying baby can reach into the brain of a lioness and activate protective responses that make no sense from an evolutionary or survival perspective, and that sometimes the most profound truths about consciousness and emotion come from watching a wild predator guard a human infant for 14 hours because her maternal instincts were stronger than her hunger. Nola approached the storage room window at approximately 6:45 p.m., 11 minutes after Sarah's death and 22 minutes after Emma's birth, and her approach was cautious in the way that predators moved when investigating unfamiliar situations that might represent either opportunity or threat. The window was open because the storage room lacked air conditioning and the evening heat was oppressive, and the sounds and smells emanating from that room created a complex sensory picture that Nola's brain was processing through multiple cognitive and instinctive filters simultaneously. There was the smell of blood, which usually indicated food opportunities for lions who were both predators and scavengers willing to take advantage of any situation that provided calories without the energy expenditure of hunting. There was the smell of humans, which typically triggered avoidance responses in lions who had learned through generations of evolution and individual experience that humans represented danger through weapons and vehicles and coordinated group behavior. And there was the sound of an infant crying, which created cognitive dissonance in Nola's brain because her maternal instincts were interpreting those cries as distress signals from something young and vulnerable that needed protection, even though the rational predator part of her brain should have been categorizing those sounds as coming from a different species that represented either prey or something to be ignored. Patricia saw Nola through the window at 6:47 p.m., and her immediate response was terror mixed with a practical understanding that screaming or sudden movement would likely trigger an attack response from a predator that was less than 5 meters from a room containing a dead woman, a newborn baby, and herself. She froze in place while maintaining eye contact with the lioness through the open window, and in that moment of locked gazes between human and predator, Patricia understood that what happened next would determine whether Emma Mitchell survived her first hour of life or became the victim of a tragedy that would compound the horror of her mother's death. Nola vocalized, making a low rumbling sound that Patricia initially interpreted as a threat display, but which experts would later analyze from audio recordings and identify as a contact call, the kind of sound that lionesses made when communicating with cubs or other pride members in non-aggressive contexts. The lioness maintained her position at the window for approximately 3 minutes, during which Emma continued crying with the unrelenting volume characteristic of newborns whose needs were not being met, and then Nola did something that Patricia could not have predicted and would struggle to believe even as she witnessed it happening. The lioness moved away from the window and positioned herself on the ground directly beneath it, lying down in sphinx position with her head up and ears forward in an alert posture that suggested she was guarding rather than hunting. Patricia remained frozen for another 2 minutes before slowly moving to look out the window at the scene below, and what she saw made no sense according to everything she knew about lion behavior and predator-prey relationships. Nala was stationed beneath the window like a sentry, positioned between the building and the open savanna in an orientation that would allow her to intercept any threats approaching from the direction where hyenas and other predators might detect the scent of blood and birth that was emanating from the storage room. The lioness showed no signs of attempting to enter the building or to access the sources of food and prey that logic suggested should have been motivating her behavior, instead simply maintaining her guard position, while Emma's crying continued to provide the acoustic stimulus that seemed to be driving this unprecedented response. The first test of Nala's intentions came at 7:15 p.m. when a clan of spotted hyenas detected the blood scent and approached the lodge from the eastern perimeter, where the fence line had gaps large enough for determined predators to navigate. Hyenas were both competitors and threats to lions in normal savanna ecology, but they were also intelligent enough to recognize when situations offered opportunities for easy meals without the usual risks of confronting lions who were defending kills or territory. 3 hyenas approached the storage room building with the confident posture of animals who had assessed the situation and determined that a single lioness guarding what was essentially a stationary food source represented an opportunity rather than a serious threat. Because 3 hyenas working cooperatively could usually drive off a lone lion through harassment and coordinated attacks that forced the larger predator to retreat rather than risk injury defending resources that could be replaced. What the hyenas had not calculated was that Nala was not defending a kill or territory, but rather responding to maternal instincts that made retreat cognitively impossible, regardless of the numerical disadvantage or injury risk involved. When the lead hyena approached within 10 meters of the building, Nala charged with speed and ferocity that shocked Patricia, who was watching from the window, and which sent all 3 hyenas into immediate retreat, with the lead animal receiving facial injuries from Nala's claws that would be visible in subsequent wildlife photographs taken by lodge guests over the following days. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds, but it established a perimeter around the storage room that hyenas would test twice more over the following hours, and would learn both times that approaching this particular lioness in this particular location resulted in violent responses that made the attempt not worth the potential reward. Marcus had been informed by Patricia about the lioness positioned beneath the storage room window, and his response had been to demand that someone shoot the predator to protect his daughter from what he viewed as an imminent threat to her survival. But lodge management had explained that they did not possess weapons capable of safely killing a lion at close range without risking bullets penetrating into the building where Emma was located, and more importantly that the lioness's behavior suggested she was protecting rather than threatening the infant, an assessment that made no sense to Marcus in his state of shock and grief, but which was supported by Patricia's observations and by the fact that Nala had already driven off one group of hyenas that would have posed a genuine threat if they had managed to access the building. The decision was made to allow the situation to continue while maintaining constant observation and while preparing contingency plans for intervention if the lioness's behavior changed from protective to predatory, though no one could articulate exactly what form that intervention would take given the constraints of weapons and proximity and the risk of harming Emma in any attempt to remove the predator. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived at 8:05 p.m., landing in the clearing adjacent to the lodge where vehicle access allowed for patient transport from buildings to landing zone. But the presence of a lioness directly beneath the storage room window created immediate complications for safely removing Emma and Sarah's body from the building, because approaching with stretchers and personnel would require passing within meters of Nala, and no one could predict whether the lioness would interpret that activity as a threat to be attacked or would simply allow humans to proceed with their activities. The helicopter pilot, a veteran of wildlife rescue operations named James Omondi, made the decision to observe the situation for 20 minutes before attempting any intervention, using that time to assess Nala's behavior patterns and to determine whether she showed any signs of preparing to attack or any responses to the helicopter noise and presence that might indicate her tolerance levels for human activity near what she appeared to be guarding. What James observed during those 20 minutes contradicted his expectations about how lions behaved in proximity to humans and how predators responded to potential prey opportunities. Nala remained in her guard position beneath the window, showing no interest in the helicopter or the humans moving around the lodge grounds. Instead, maintaining her focus on the perimeter, she appeared to be defending and responding with alertness, but not aggression to various sounds and movements occurring around her. Emma's crying had decreased in frequency and volume as exhaustion set in, but whenever the infant vocalized, Nola's ears would orient toward the sound and her body posture would shift into higher alertness, suggesting that those acoustic signals were the primary stimulus driving her protective behavior. James had worked in African wildlife rescue for 15 years and had encountered numerous situations involving dangerous animals and human safety, but he had never witnessed anything resembling what he was seeing beneath that storage room window. A wild lioness maintaining vigil over a human infant in apparent response to maternal instincts that had overridden predatory impulses. The extraction of Emma and Sarah's body required careful coordination between medical personnel and wildlife experts, who maintained constant monitoring of Nola's position and behavior while stretchers were brought to the storage room door. The lioness watched this activity with apparent interest, but made no moves to interfere or attack, allowing the humans to enter and exit the building while she remained approximately 8 meters away in her established guard position. Emma was removed at 8:35 p.m., wrapped in blankets and carried by Patricia toward the helicopter, while James and 2 other staff members positioned themselves between the infant and Nola to provide human barriers in case the lioness interpreted the removal as a threat requiring intervention. But Nola made no attempt to approach or interfere, instead simply watching as Emma was carried away from the building she had been guarding for nearly 2 hours since first taking up her position beneath the window. What the medical team and lodge staff did not realize at the time was that Nola's vigil had actually begun not at 6:45 p.m. when she first approached the window, but much earlier at approximately 7 a.m. that same morning when she had been resting near the lodge perimeter and had first detected the scent of Sarah's pregnancy through chemical signals that lionesses were extraordinarily sensitive to given their need to identify reproductive status in both prey and pride members. Rangers reviewing their camera trap footage in the weeks following the incident discovered images showing Nola in proximity to the lodge during multiple time points throughout the day of Emma's birth, suggesting that the lioness had been monitoring the location for hours before Sarah went into labor, and had perhaps been drawn to the area by the olfactory cues associated with late pregnancy that were detectable to predators with acute chemical sensing capabilities. If this timeline was accurate, then Nola's involvement in Emma's story had lasted not 3 hours, but rather 14 hours from morning observation through evening vigil, representing a sustained interest and eventually protective response that had no parallel in documented lion behavior toward humans. The significance of this 14-hour timeline was not immediately apparent to researchers, because the dramatic events occurred during the evening vigil when Nola positioned herself beneath the window and actively defended Emma from hyenas. But Dr. Kimothy's subsequent analysis suggested that the extended period of monitoring prior to the birth might have been crucial in establishing the cognitive and emotional framework that led to Nola's protective response. Lions were territorial animals who tracked the movements and status of everything within their range, including human settlements, and a pregnant woman at a safari lodge represented an unusual element that would have attracted Nola's attention through both curiosity and the instinctive assessment that mammals made about whether situations presented threats or opportunities. The 14 hours of intermittent observation might have created a form of familiarity or investment in Sarah's situation that primed Nola to respond protectively when the infant's cries indicated distress, rather than simply ignoring or attacking as lions typically would when encountering vulnerable humans. Sarah's body was removed 15 minutes later with similar precautions and similar lack of interference from Nola, and once both removals were complete, James made the decision to document the lioness's behavior with video footage that would later be analyzed by wildlife biologists and animal behavior specialists trying to understand what had driven this unprecedented response. The footage showed Nola remaining in her guard position for an additional 40 minutes after Emma had been taken to the helicopter, as if she had not yet processed that the infant she had been protecting was no longer present, or as if she was continuing to defend the location where she had last heard the crying that had activated her maternal instincts. At 9:25 p.m., nearly 3 hours after first approaching the storage room window, Nola finally stood and walked away from the building, moving slowly toward the tree line where she disappeared into the darkness of the savanna that was her natural habitat and where her own cubs were presumably waiting for her return. The analysis of what had occurred during those 3 hours between 6:45 p.m. and 9:25 p.m. on that March evening in 2019 occupied researchers and wildlife behavior specialists for months after the incident. generating papers and conference presentations and extensive debates about animal consciousness and cross-species maternal recognition, and the extent to which mammalian brains shared common neural architectures that could create behavioral responses transcending species boundaries. Dr. Elizabeth Kimothi, a wildlife biologist specializing in lion behavior at the University of Dar es Salaam, was granted access to all video and audio recordings from the incident, and her subsequent analysis provided the most comprehensive scientific explanation for why a lioness would guard a human infant rather than viewing that infant as prey or simply ignoring it as irrelevant to her survival needs. Dr. Kimothi's analysis focused on the acoustic properties of newborn human crying and how those sounds compared to the vocalizations made by lion cubs in distress, and her findings suggested that there was substantial overlap in the frequency ranges, temporal patterns, and emotional urgency conveyed by infant distress calls across mammalian species. The crying that Emma produced after her birth fell within acoustic parameters that Nola's auditory system would have processed as similar enough to lion cub distress calls to activate maternal response circuits in her brain, particularly given that Nola had cubs of her own and her neurological state was primed for hyperresponsiveness to infant signals. The fact that Emma was human rather than lion should theoretically have been detected through visual or olfactory cues that would have overridden the acoustic stimulus, but Dr. Kimothi argued that the combination of factors present in this situation, including Nola's recent motherhood, the intensity and persistence of Emma's crying, and possibly individual variation in Nola's temperament and cognitive processing, created a perfect storm where maternal instincts became more salient than species recognition. The protective behavior that Nola displayed toward Emma was consistent with how lionesses guarded vulnerable cubs from threats, including the positioning beneath the window that provided optimal surveillance of potential danger approaches, the aggressive responses to hyenas that attempted to investigate the area, and the sustained vigil that lasted for hours despite the absence of any obvious benefit to Nola in terms of food or reproductive fitness. Dr. Kimothi's paper concluded that what had occurred was an example of supernormal stimulus, where an acoustic signal, Emma's crying, had activated behavioral programs in Nola's brain with intensity sufficient to override the cognitive and instinctive systems that would normally have categorized the infant as either prey or irrelevant, creating a situation where Nola's brain treated Emma as if she were a lion cub requiring protection from a mother who could not abandon her post even when logic and self-interest suggested she should. Emma Mitchell survived her first night of life in the neonatal intensive care unit at Arusha Medical Center, where she received the feeding and care that her premature birth and motherless status required. Marcus Mitchell struggled with grief and guilt and the overwhelming challenge of becoming a single parent to a newborn while simultaneously processing the traumatic death of his wife and the bizarre circumstances of his daughter's first hours of life. The medical evacuation team that transported Emma from Caribou Safari Lodge included in their report the extraordinary fact that a wild lioness had guarded the infant for 3 hours, and that detail became part of Emma's medical records and eventually part of the story that Marcus would tell his daughter when she was old enough to understand the circumstances of her birth and her mother's death. 5 years later, in 2024, Marcus returned to Caribou Safari Lodge with Emma, who was by then a healthy 5-year-old with no memory of her traumatic birth, but who had grown up hearing the story of the lioness who had protected her during her first hours of life. The lodge had erected a small memorial to Sarah Mitchell at the location where she had died, and Marcus brought Emma to that memorial to help her understand the mother she would never know and the sacrifice that Sarah had made by insisting on the safari trip that had resulted in her death. While they were visiting the memorial, lodge staff informed Marcus that Nola was still alive and still occasionally seen in the areas surrounding the lodge, now 8 years old with a new generation of cubs, and that wildlife researchers tracking her movements had confirmed her identity through photo documentation and GPS collar data. Marcus asked whether it would be possible to see Nola, knowing that the request was unusual and that wild lions could not be summoned on demand, but hoping that somehow his daughter might be able to glimpse the animal that had played such a crucial role in her survival during the most vulnerable hours of her life. Lodge management arranged for a guided drive to areas where Nola had been recently sighted, and on their second evening at the lodge, Marcus and Emma observed from their vehicle as Nola rested beneath the same acacia tree where she had been positioned on the evening of Emma's birth 5 years earlier. Emma asked whether that was the lion who had protected her as a baby, and Marcus confirmed that according to the researchers, this was indeed the same lioness, though there was no way to know whether Nola had any memory or recognition of the events that had occurred 5 years ago, or whether she even understood what she had done during those 3 hours when maternal instinct had transformed her from predator to protector. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think about the mysterious bonds that connect mothers to infants across species boundaries, and the ways that evolution has programmed all mammalian brains to respond to the distress signals of the young, even when those signals come from different species, we would be honored if you would share your thoughts with our community. Please tell us in the comments. How old are you, and where in the world are you watching from? And if you feel comfortable sharing, have you ever witnessed moments when animals displayed behaviors that seemed to transcend their normal patterns and suggested emotional depths that science struggles to fully explain? Your stories matter because they remind us that consciousness and emotion and the bonds of motherhood represent territories where much remains unknown despite centuries of scientific study, and where the most profound truths often come not from laboratories, but from moments like Emma's first hours of life, when a lioness chose to guard rather than to hunt, because something in her brain recognized the universal cry of an infant who needed protection. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more true tales that prove maternal instincts can override millions of years of evolutionary programming, that the sound of a crying baby carries meaning that crosses species boundaries, and that sometimes the most unlikely guardian is exactly the one who appears when survival hangs in the balance. Thank you for being part of our community, and for bringing your open hearts to these stories that challenge everything we think we understand about the borders between human and animal experience.